so let's go to Kabbalah, I guess. There's something that's called the Bibliographia Kabbalistica. What exactly is that? Is that a work of Gershom Scholem? Is that something?
That's a work of Gershom Scholem. That's a work in German in 1927. Even though Scholem was already in Israel, he was still doing some publishing in Germany, including this work. And it's basically a bibliographic work of books of Kabbalah and books about Kabbalah. So he basically goes in and lists every work that he was aware of and gives sort of bibliographical notations about it. One of the things that Scholem did in the early stages of his scholarship was he really did a tremendous amount of bibliographic work. What he was doing in the early stages was really mapping out all the Kabbalah literature, because there was so much Kabbalistic literature, and a lot of it's still in manuscript, which I'll mention in a moment, and a bit more about that. There was so much material, and no one had really sat down and organized it. For example, what was written first? What was written second? What was copied from what? Who was influenced by whom? Where were things written? Especially when you get to manuscripts, that gets much more complicated, obviously. So I'd like to mention in this context that in 1930, Scholem wrote a separate book describing all the Kabbalistic manuscripts at the Hebrew University National Library. It was even in the few years since he kind of got on the case of Magnus to start buying manuscripts, there were enough manuscripts for him to publish a whole volume on that topic. So both the Bibliographia Kabbalistica, which deals primarily with published works, and his book on the Kabbalistic manuscripts, which came a few years later, are part of his very big initial project, which is really to give a bibliographical detailed description and mapping out of all the Kabbalistic literature, which he felt was necessary before you could really start going into depth analyzing the content.
And what did Gershom Scholem write subsequently about the content? What books did he publish, and what was his approach to Kabbalah? Okay,
so he viewed himself as a historian of Kabbalah, and as with his primary tool being philology, the rigorous analysis of texts or close reading of texts, and the historical part having a lot to do with analyzing in what ways, sort of intellectual history, who influenced who, and as who took ideas from an earlier Kabbalistic work and how did they change them and develop them themselves, and what happened to that in the next stage as well. The place where you see this the most, and I'm still not quite in the content, but his really most famous work is The Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, which came out in 1941 based on a series of lectures he'd given in New York, and subsequently translated into several other languages, Hebrew only recently, surprisingly. And in that book, you really see his historical approach. He's really, in a sense, a modernist. He has a meta-narrative. It's kind of a Hegelian grand scheme of how things develop. So he talks about the earliest Jewish mysticism in the time of Chazal, what he calls the Merkavah mysticism, or the Hechalot mysticism. And then you get into the earliest Kabbalah being developed in Provence, which he doesn't talk about very much in that book. He wrote a separate book on that topic. And then, of course, you come to the Zohar and other medieval Kabbalah, such as Rabbi Avram Abulafia. And after that, you come to the early modern period in Safed, the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, the Ari, and then he brings in Sabbatianism, which is a whole other big topic in his writings, Jewish Messianism, and then you come to the Hasidic movement. So that's how he sort of develops it. In the Major Trends book, when it comes to the Zohar, he has two chapters. One chapter is about the authorship of the Zohar, which was a long-standing kind of debate between the Orthodox community who attributed the Zohar to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from the 2nd century, and the scholarly community, which by and large attributed the Zohar to Rabbi Moshe de Leon, who was a great Spanish Kabbalist in the end of the 13th century. Scholem went back and forth a little bit and before he finally adopted the Moshe de Leon authorship theory. So that was one chapter. The second chapter is about the theories of the Zohar. What is the Kabbalah of the Zohar? How is it described? And there he goes into detail of the philosophy of the Zohar, so to speak. So a lot of what he wrote was, as I said, of a bibliographical nature and theorizing about the development. So the one major book that he wrote later was, some people called it the missing chapter from Major Trends, which became an entire book called The Origins of the Kabbalah, where he traces the Kabbalah's development in the early Middle Ages in Provence, primarily, and spreading from there into various parts of Spain, Castilla and Catalonia, and so he's really very, very much of a historian. But he does have places as well where he goes more into content. The difference between him and the generation that came after him, and this is a big topic in and of itself, but just to mention one aspect, is that he didn't deal very much with mystical practices. He was much more interested in mystical theory. And the generation of scholars that were his students and my teachers are much more interested as well in mystical practices. That was something that Scholem was less taken by. He sort of viewed Kabbalah almost like a type of mystical philosophy, and looked at it less as in terms of the way of life that went along with it. Although he obviously was aware of that and doesn't ignore it, but it's not his main way of looking at things.